Good afternoon. On behalf of the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress, welcome to our conversation today on what is a very timely and important topic, looking ahead into 2023 and preparing for the next pandemic issues facing the upcoming congressional session. Of course, this conversation has to involve quite a bit of looking back at the lessons learned over the last several years in terms of pandemic preparedness and response. And it would be a great shame if we didn't incorporate some of those lessons into our future thinking, putting ourselves in a better position for what we know will be a coming challenge. We can't define what that challenge will look like, what the scope or scale or definition exactly will be, but we do know that pandemics are always around the corner and we have to be prepared. It's something that we had looked at several years ago. The center took an effort to compile some recommendations around biosecurity and preparedness. At that stage, we were really looking more at purposeful bioterrorism or attacks, biowarfare agents developed by foreign powers that might be deployed against us, and looking at measures that we should be taking to prepare ourselves for such a nefarious attack. Turns out that most of the recommendations we made at that time actually apply very well, whether you're talking about a pathogen that is purposefully created and deployed, or one that occurs in nature, or one that comes from a source that you're not really sure how to define. But our lessons learned, our recommendations focused quite a bit on preparation, stockpiling needed materials and pharmaceuticals, coordination across various levels of the U.S. government. As we are a large country with various levels of administration that in many cases need really high levels of coordination to be effective. Also looking at coordination across countries, because obviously pandemics don't really respect international boundaries. They travel on planes and other methodologies. So coordinating and sharing information and helping being prepared together with other countries was also an important part of that. Now we have several years of distinctive data developed around COVID-19. We have some ability to look at how we responded and what we ought to do, either do what we did well or what we ought to change. I think one of the key factors that changed from our initial look at biosecurity has been the actually very exciting technological developments in terms of vaccine development. The technology, the speed, I think surprised many of us, particularly lay people like myself who are outside the pharmaceutical industry, but it really was quite an incredible good news story in terms of our ability to respond to COVID-19. And I hope that we can incorporate some of the lessons learned from that process and those technological developments as we look ahead. So we're very pleased to have Phyllis Arthur and Christopher Joyner with us today in a discussion that will be moderated by CSPC Senior Vice President Dan Mahaffee. And let's look at some of these questions and get some great expert insights and try to set ourselves up for a better response in the future. We have envisioned a program over the coming year of some deep conversations on lessons learned and how we can be better prepared, what recommendations we give to our Congress and executive branch in affiliation with industry. And this is a good kickoff for that set of discussions. So with that, let me say thanks to our speakers today. Thanks to Dan for moderating. And Dan, I will go ahead and turn over the discussion to you.
Thank you, Glenn. And yes, just to second everything you said there, what an important topic, something that we've seen firsthand the importance of. And as we've discussed in many ways, questions about how we resource our responses, how we can prepare, what lessons we can learn, and truly a field where, as they say, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of the cure. But how to can we also understand that we need to make the next cure on the fly, how we need to better catch these earlier in their exposures or as epidemics begin, and what lessons can we learn in communicating to the public as well as our foreign partners in this important topic. And I can't say more about the experts that we have here with us today, two excellent folks who know plenty about this. I'll start with Phyllis Arthur, briefly introduce her. She's joining us from the Biotechnology Innovation Organization, BIO. There she works with her member companies on vaccines, molecular diagnostics, and biodefense policy, legislative, and regulatory issues. Prior to that, she worked at the vaccine division of Merck Company, one of our major champions in healthcare. And during that time, she worked on several vaccines, including Gardasil, which is responsible for really changing the public health story around HPV. So during that time, has worked also with managers and representatives covering multiple states and countries. She has experience at the Brookings Institution, as well as her BA from Goucher College and an MBA from Wharton. So thank you, Phyllis, for joining us today. Christopher Joyner as well has been a career congressional staff member, and he's joining us today from Overwatch Strategic Advisors. He served as staff director of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence and has had more than 20 years of experience covering national security, foreign policy, and energy. He's helped work with the committee, one of those ones we know on intelligence. It's a bipartisan committee. You can't do anything there without working together. So he's known how to work both sides of the aisle with expertise on some of these very important topics and can understand firsthand what Congress's role is in ensuring that we're prepared, both in terms of the threats as well as the resources needed for the future. With that, though, I'd like to have our speakers share some of their initial thoughts before we get to the discussion. You know, what we can see on some of the lessons learned, what they think we can apply for the future, and what Congress, most importantly, should be considering as they look to the next year. Obviously, they're going to try and get a few things done before the wire here, fingers crossed that we see something, that isn't just kicking the can down the road. But still in 2023, the pandemic all hazards preparedness reauthorization will be coming up. That's a major opportunity. There's lots of other legislative proposals on the table right now as well, given looking at pandemic outcomes. But what are those lessons? And Phyllis, I'll start with you. What are those lessons we can apply from what you've seen and your expertise?
Well, Dan, thank you. And Congressman Nye, thank you so much. Chris, great to be on this panel with you. It's such an important topic. And at Bio, we are spending a lot of time thinking about those core things that we learned during COVID, and actually even during the pandemic influenza 2009 that we had. So we have a couple of key priorities that I think will help us be better prepared. And we're very much focused on what will make us more prepared. So there's definitely things we need to do to make sure our response is as clear as possible. But we think a lot of those things will go more smoothly if we really focus on many of the issues that will help us be better prepared. That, like you said, a penny spent, a dollar saved. Here it's spend $1 billion, save $1 trillion, just say, or trillions actually. So we're focusing on a couple of things that came out of COVID. So Operation Warp Speed and the CAG, particularly Operation Warp Speed, actually embodied an amazing approach to leveraging great science already done and working closely with industry to actually think through those things that needed to be done in a public-private partnership to actually iterate and learn on the really rapidly on clinical trials, development, and manufacturing in particular expertise to get those vaccines and the therapeutics out in record time. So remember, it wasn't just the vaccines that came quickly, the monoclonal antibodies also came quickly. They needed to refine the science. We needed to figure out how to do the clinical trials, having guidance from the FDA early on what were the hurdles for vaccines. Extremely helpful. All the companies had to meet those hurdles. That gave you that comparator. Having active created for therapeutics meant that you avoided having little teeny studies that didn't tell you anything. Instead, you could collectively look at all the hospitalized patients in the beginning of the pandemic and use multiple different shots on goal of different kinds of modalities to see what worked, both in terms of handling the host outcomes as well as the virus. So these two approaches need to be thought of as what part of those two infrastructures need to be standing in peacetime, right? What do you need to have ready? Setting up Operation Warp Speed and setting up active on the fly, fabulous as they were, what parts of those infrastructures should we be putting inside ASPR, BARDA, FEMC, right? The Pandemic Health Emergencies Medical Countermeasures Enterprise. So how do we think about that? One of the things we've been very supportive of is something that came out of the President's American Preparedness Plan, which is the idea of some kind of mission control. One of the things that made Operation Warp Speed work so well was there were 2 or 3 core leaders who were driving the strategic activities. And that probably needs to sit like Dr. Jha sits right now in a White House that coordinates the FEMC, which is led by ASPR and DoD. We need that even during peacetime to make sure the strategy is set out clearly and that the agencies are working in collaboration together, moving products across the life course, making sure they're stockpiled, et cetera. We're certainly focused on the SNS, and I think you mentioned this, right? The SNS suddenly became a thing, a household word, where those of us who were in the space for years, no one ever knew what that thing was. And literally, we need to make sure that with all the different missions that an SNS has to do during a pandemic, that it's funded appropriately, authorized appropriately, staffed appropriately to handle multiple different kinds of product types in peacetime and in response time. And obviously, there's a lot to be done to fund the whole entire enterprise itself during peacetime. I'll mention one more thing that's pivotal. One of the reasons we could go so fast, particularly on mRNA, but also on some of the other technologies, was all the work done in peacetime on that science. How can we leverage that idea around a list of pathogens of pandemic potential? So you hear people discussing something like viral family research. Let's take the 6 or 7 most problematic pathogen families, viral families, where there's at least 1 or 2 sisters or cousins in that family that actually have the chance to be pandemic, and actually do research on vaccines, monoclonal antibodies, antiviral technologies, and diagnostics technologies for that family. The reason mRNA could go quickly, it had been working on SARS, it had been used for MERS. So what can we do to actually at least get somewhat ready for those things we know have pandemic potential? The way to do that is a set of R&D around multiple different kinds of technologies, around multiple different families, working with industry such that things are ready or at least pre-positioned for when disease X hits. We know what family it's in, we pull those things, those technologies get deployed against that new disease, we learn what's different about it than what we've already done, and we're ready to go into that situation like an active or like we did for vaccine trials, where those products can quickly get jump-started and manufacturing scale up when clinical trials can happen.
Phyllis, all great thoughts and a lot to think through as we go through. And I think one thing I'll want to get back to, and maybe Chris can touch on this on the threat, is you talk about those families to prepare for. I think we'll want to dive into more of what might those be and what sort of the racking and stacking, as they were, of the threat from those. But Christopher, too, you've seen this in terms of preparedness and understanding the threat we face, both from man-made as well as natural challenges. What are the lessons you see as important to be considering for the next Congress?
Well, I'll get to one of the things that Glenn started with, is everybody seemed to focus on, when you talk about bioterrorism, for example, just the low probability but potentially high consequence type things like bioterrorism, biowarfare that really got everybody's attention. But in the day, it's the less sexy public health preparedness and response stuff that just to prepare for the annual flu that everybody really needed to focus on. The benefit, of course, is that by investing in one, you are helping prepare for the other. And I think certainly over the last 3 years, some of the things that have really stood out and that have receiving attention for really potentially for the first time, that need for and the importance of global disease surveillance that we see it when it makes headlines, but those things that require that international cooperation, the communication, transparency, because there will be a next pandemic. What it is, what it could be, obviously we'll discuss later, but internally, domestically, in the security agencies, the ones that I'm most familiar with, is that there's a need to treat pandemics as the security threat that they are. They have, and as we've seen over the last 3 years, a massive economic impact, setting aside the human toll that we've had to deal with. And it's really Congress and its oversight role, working with the intelligence community, those kind of forward deployed elements, State Department, the Department of Defense, and its medical coverage, and the CDC and its kind of global role, working in places like the Ebola zone to help identify new and emerging threats and new outbreaks, needs to get continued interest and attention in Congress, just to make sure that those tools and those resources, and to the extent additional authorities are needed to really cover down on these challenges. There is a critical role for the United States and international organizations that needs to be addressed as well, whether it's the UN, the World Health Organization, work with international charitable organizations. The U.S. needs to have a strong presence there too. And, we need to use those seats that we have and those positions we have to make sure that leadership in those organizations are focusing appropriately on the threats and challenges. And when we do have outbreaks, that we call them as we see them, and that we don't give in to elements of national pride that may not be excited about, having to wear that scarlet letter, whether it's, scarlet letter E for Ebola or scarlet letter C for COVID, that the ground truth, as close as we can get to it, is critical to helping inform responses, and we need to be able to have that. And those are things that the intelligence community, State Department, Department of Defense can help inform, help you get that ground truth that certain societies may not be willing to share publicly, but it can have a critical role in how we respond and the speed with which we are able to do so.
Thank you, Chris. And that I think it's to where we were looking at, what are some of those next threats? And Phyllis, I'll kind of ask you to identify what some of those are. And then Chris, after Phyllis has kind of outlined some of those, maybe your thoughts on where the threat would be with some of those pathogens, as well as what we need to do to have the early warning that they're coming.
Dan, actually, Chris touched something really important, which is bio threats and pandemic threats. We are the ones who've decided on this compartmentalization. But in actuality, if you look at what happened the last 3 years, Ebola was sitting only on the bio threat list, right? It was a public health threat, right? Smallpox, always on one of the top things on the bio threat list. Now we have monkeypox, right? So these two examples actually prove two of my points, which is the bio threat list needs, the threat list needs to include things on the bio threat list because nature does pop little anthrax outbreaks, right? Everything's not just a bad guy walks into the Superdome and, hits everybody with anthrax spores, right? Some of these things are naturally occurring as well as can be weaponized, which is why the list is so important. So I think a piece of that list has to be some of the bio threats that actually also can occur in nature and unfortunately show up at our door. Obviously, some of those also have the opportunity to be weaponized and thus need to be prepared for in a
Mhm.
bioterror threat. I think the other thing is the smallpox is a perfect example of a viral family where the orthopoxes have monkeypox, smallpox, but working on smallpox, working on the most deadly in that family allowed us to have medical countermeasures that could quickly be looked at for a less severe but equally related disease. The flaviviruses, certainly continuing to look at the coronaviruses. The WHO actually published what's called an R&D blueprint for pandemic pathogens. This is what CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, has been using as they do their partnerships with industry on early stage research. It's got Rift Valley fever, it's got Nile, chikungunya, but it's got some diseases on it specifically that have had outbreaks over the past 5-6 years that could have indeed turned into pandemics or epidemics. But I think there's a core set of families that those pathogens fit into that one could do research that's a little broader to, do you want to look at RNA viruses and look at mRNA and how it works on those, et cetera. But there are several lists floating around right now, particularly that WHO list that I think many people feel expresses the families that are probably the most important. And we never can take our eye off of influenza. Never, ever, ever can we take our eye off influenza. It moves so fast. It has that zoonotic element that's very unique, how quickly you can go from chickens or pigs to people with very virulent strains of flu. It goes fast, and you have to go fast when you're making a vaccine for it. So influenza has to stay on the top of that list, and we need better ways to make faster and better vaccines for that, and diagnostics and therapeutics. I think we're learning that lesson right now with the outbreak, with the bad flu season we're having. We need new approaches to every one of these viral families. And one could even put bacteria on there, but I think that adds another layer of complexity. But there are a few toxins that probably fit in this category too. But I think viral family research is an approach, and there are some great lists from WHO and others that could really help us do some good research and development in preparedness times.
Chris, in terms of, as we talk to, we can identify, as you lay out those families, we can start to study them, but how do we improve the surveillance, the intelligence of, the more time we have to understand that either the guy in the trench coat in the Superdome or the flare up on, in some river valley on the other side of the world, how do you improve our surveillance so that we have more lead time, that we can mobilize from mobilize if we talk about these resources? How can we mobilize knowing earlier?
Well, one of the things is that we obviously need to treat, put pandemics and outbreaks like this kind of on kind of at the appropriate place in our intelligence framework. I mean, and it doesn't necessarily need to be all super secret squirrel type of activity here, right? I mean, this is a presence on the ground, whether it's a State Department diplomat or a CDC investigator, or intelligence officer serving overseas. Need to be able to keep track of these and pay attention to these, whether including using open source tools and methods. But it also requires engagement with partners around the world. They have to be willing to share what they're seeing as well. We can't cover everything everywhere all the time. We probably shouldn't try, but working in partnership with others around the world, as long as we have that commitment to share information and to exchange ideas, then we're ahead of the game. And shouldn't take anything away from the global surveillance efforts that already take place in this space. I mean, CDC and its teams are active around the world. I mentioned earlier that, kind of a leading indicator for us too is, their presence in places like the Ebola zone and in sub-Saharan Africa. But again, treating it like the national security threat that they can be is the first real step, and putting it higher on the priority list than it sometimes has been in the past. At the same time, we also can't reinvent the wheel every time we go through this exercise. And one of the big challenges, and I think we lived through it, and potentially helped prepare us for 2019 and 2020, is going through the Ebola exercise in 2014, 2015. Plans on the shelf, personnel in place, experts ready to go. There's the international component that became a domestic one. But there is that tendency in government and Congress and the executive branch to reinvent that wheel every time we go through this exercise. And it allows for and brings into the puts unnecessary delays into the middle of a response.
100% agree. I think the other thing is to look at, as you know, there's some international, I think Chris actually alluded to these, there's some international activities happening as well over the next 2 years that could hopefully strengthen that sharing of data. There's an amendment process going on within the WHO for continuing to strengthen the international health regulations. This could hopefully be one place where there's that commitment by all countries to rapidly share information on emerging infectious diseases and make sure so we don't have to do it ourselves, as Chris said, super important. So how can we get all the countries to abide by IHR? They see something happening actually in the animal population and they flag it then. Like, we've got to go backwards into the reservoir and make sure we're understanding, camels and MERS, right? This is what we all learned, right? Bats and other things, avian flu. And so how do we actually link the whole ecosystem of infectious diseases and have all countries sharing information on what they're seeing, so that when you see that first animal to human transmission, everybody's flares go up and you start looking for things, and you start sequencing. Right, and you start sharing those sequences so you can see if it's the same in other places. So there has to be that absolute coordination and collaboration between countries in the whole zoonotic space for viruses. And Congress can certainly help to make sure that that is happening, making sure the CDC is well equipped to do that, making sure the State Department is making that a core priority in their WHO negotiations.
I think important to think about getting it earlier, but looking at the notes too, we're tracking here. How do you think we did in terms of communicating among our own surveillance organizations in COVID, and what can we learn, even from monkeypox perhaps as well, as we've seen that too, in terms of getting the communication from where the local level to the state to the federal. How did we do there, and how can that be improved?
So I think we did okay. Actually, I would say I was a little saddened that having gone through COVID, that monkeypox didn't go as smoothly as it should have, given that we've just been through a massive global pandemic and we had literally armed everyone, and we still found ourselves having communication issues between agencies and the states, right? Who needed, I'll point to an example that I think, again, no one thought of because we're going through this for the first time. That issue of states order vaccines from one particular data system that's linked to the CDC. But the monkeypox vaccines were coming from the Strategic National Stockpile, which is just a different system. So suddenly the states needing to get a vaccine for an outbreak in their state needed to learn a new system for ordering. And there wasn't enough time necessarily to connect these two systems, so the states would have an easier process for getting their orders in as they tried to do all the different events and vaccinate the core target population with the monkeypox vaccine. Those things caused delays, but I think we're learning from that, and ASPR and CDC are working together to try to make sure these two systems are linked. I feel like if we looked at each stage of how you would respond, inside of it was some coordination problem that no one envisioned. And I think particularly federal to state and locality is one of those that needs to be strengthened, because those people on the ground in the states are doing everything public health, right? They're responding to a measles outbreak in the middle of responding to COVID, in the middle of responding to monkeypox, and they're doing all the other things that public health does every day, right? making sure we're testing for TB and handling HIV. So it's not like any of the other stuff they have to do goes away. How can we make it easier for them system-wise to be able to do the things they need to do, get the data they need to get? I'll say, I think the other thing none of us realized was how much you need a PHE, a public health declaration, in order to get data flowing freely back and forth between the states and the federal government, which is pivotal to timely evidence-based decision-making. So for us, this is another thing that's really important for Congress to understand is if we want to make evidence-based decisions in an emergency, we need some data to actually be free-flowing, not in emergency. We need to know where the immunization pockets are where are the underserved immunization pockets, where are other things happening where that represents weakness in the public health infrastructure that we need to shore up for emergencies and, as Chris said, national health security issues.
One of the things that I know we don't want to probably spend too much time on this side of it, but there is a significant role here on the communication side and how that plays into the political space we've kind of found ourselves in, where everything that we talk about is intensely political. And unfortunately, regrettably, this space is not immune to those challenges. And, the CDC and the state level folks can be in a tough spot, considering that the speed with which misinformation and disinformation can spread in the social media space. They're constantly chasing that down while also having to communicate what is right in front of them at any given moment. It is a factor that can't be overlooked. How Congress tackles that piece of it, there is a significant leadership role for Congress in that part of it alone, just in terms of leading by example. And that will be, the next time we have to deal with this, whenever that might be, is it this season's kind of convergence of flu and COVID and RSV? Is it the next one? Some may be more manageable than others, right? But, dealing with this 50% argument over all things, I would hate to see that enter into a conversation over something like a smallpox outbreak, something that is potentially hugely more consequential and something where we really need to get it right the first time.
Yes, I think it's really important. I know everybody has the word pandemic fatigue, right? But it's really important that we be able to focus on our preparedness, and we think of this exactly the way Chris said. It's a national defense issue, right? This is our national health security. This is our ability to protect Americans in a way that fosters international collaboration, early warning, being ready to respond as quickly as possible and get through it as fast as we can in an evidence-based and scientific way. And a lot of that has to be driven by data. And we just have to acknowledge we're going to have more of these. I mean, we've had like 10 infectious disease emergencies in 5 or 7 years. We can't avoid these. And so readiness is going to be the strength that gets us into recovery as quickly as possible.
Well, I think those are great points on readiness, and almost some of the ones on information, preparedness, resilience almost becomes a public education matter more than just specifically a health matter. I feel like we could have an entire discussion just on the personal resilience side of it and personal preparedness messaging. But
I mean, if you think about the way people deal with hurricanes, right? You have a hurricane,
right.
And afterwards you spend time trying to figure out how to not have as bad of an issue the next hurricane. Right. You don't say there's not going to be any more hurricanes. You say, exactly. I need to be better prepared for the next hurricane. What do I need to do? And that's where we are at this moment. We're preparing for the infectious disease tsunamis that could come our way and thinking about how to make sure we can respond to those.
And what are the tools too that we need to have in place for, it's so important for our public health leaders though, to be able to get things, I hate to say this, to get things right early in the early in the messaging, while also and acknowledging too that, you know, science is imperfect, but how do we better equip the public? You know, and I guess it's scientific literacy partially too, but how do you get the that ability to communicate trust? You know, how do you ensure that in the future?
So we've been spending a lot of time on this within bio. In the end, I think if you look at what happened with COVID, I think the lessons learned from COVID here are really important. There was, particularly in the year before vaccines were available, in the first year that vaccines were available, there was a market and extremely important investment in working with all different kinds of community leaders to make sure they had the right information and they were communicating with their, I'll call it, constituents in essence. So, you know, the Black Coalition Against COVID was organized with the 4 historically Black college medical schools, the Unidos US and all these different across the board, now, you know, rural health associations, everybody mobilized to actually make sure that the people they served, who trusted them as messengers, were getting the right information from them. And I think that is something we have to do for this entire space of health security. We're thinking about this in terms of routine immunization, right? Strengthening people's understanding of why routine immunization is important is part of our resilience. So when I'm making the next vaccine for an outbreak, you understand that the FDA is going to do this and the CDC's role is that, and I'm going to make sure you see the data, et cetera, et cetera. Those things are things we can continue to do around key elements in peacetime that we know are cornerstone to resilience. So doing that around flu, doing that around the need for public health infrastructure and what it does every day, these kinds of things, working with trusted messengers in various communities, as local as we can get, right, are, I think, the cornerstone to having people feel like they're not getting hoodwinked to buy information, or they're hearing the wrong information from the wrong voice. And we find those right voices for every community, whether that's a rural hospital or Congress. One of the doctor caucuses from the GOP, they did a great infographic, a great PSA on this issue, right? We need to do this for every part of the American public, so they feel there's a place to go to get trusted information on these things.
Yeah, they, you know, government officials at all levels obviously need to have a presence in this space, particularly the communication space. And it really needs to be all hands on deck. But we need to be prepared for the fact that, you know, adversary countries will and have inserted all kinds of misinformation, disinformation surrounding diseases, pandemics. You know, like Russian intelligence services and propaganda, for example, have probably blamed the US for everything from HIV AIDS to Zika to Ebola to swine flu to bird flu to COVID. They'll insert and have inserted kind of vaccine skepticism into the space. You know, sometimes it bites back, right? You know, Russian efforts surrounding vaccine skepticism, you know, just like everything else, is really intended for foreign consumption. But sometimes it creeps back into their own space and it bites them. And they had one of the, you know, worst COVID responses and probably one of the worst vaccine uptakes kind of anywhere on the planet, and they paid for it. But it's not going to stop them from doing it the next time. It is a continuing thing. We just need to be prepared for it. And, you know, folks in the CDC need to be present to respond, as do others.
Chris, I think as we lay out this image of preparedness, you know, we're all agreeing on the threat, the need to resource it. How do we structure this, though, in a way where we avoid Congress's tendency, you know, when things are calm, when you're not worrying about it, it's easy to bring down the resources or perhaps raid that account or spending for something else. How do we make sure that these preparedness efforts for pandemics, one, that we focus on them when there isn't the crisis, that we stay focused, as well as protect the resources so that they aren't you know, used for other things in peacetime, as we would say?
Yeah, there's a requirement for a commitment in Congress to ongoing oversight of these matters, and the tools that Congress's disposal. We've got committee staff on both sides of the Hill who are fantastic and know their issues backwards and forwards, and can really play a role in keeping kind of the executive's feet to the fire on these issues. The resources of the GAO and resources of the Congressional Research Service, they're all there and present, and need to be engaged in keeping tabs on these issues. That's the only way for Congress to work on these issues in the background while confronting whatever the issue of the day is. There needs to be that constant oversight presence in place to keep focused on it.
I think the other thing is for the president's budget to reflect that this is a priority to Congress, so they have something to respond to. It needs to be included there, so the back and forth on the funding can have a discussion across all the agencies involved. Sorry, I live on 14th Street, so there's sirens. My apologies for that. And then I think the other thing is there might actually be some budget mechanisms that might be considered to make this national health security issue a little bit of a take it off the top, to protect in peacetime those resources across HHS and DoD in particular that are about getting ready for these issues. So it would be interesting to see if we could have a budget conversation about whether there's a budget mechanism for carving out some narrow set of funding that's not touched, to make sure this particular space, this national security space, doesn't suffer the vagaries of ups and downs of appropriations.
And ideally ring fence those resources and make sure that we have the, if we talk about, and maybe we can touch on this too, some of that infrastructure, like you say, the mission control, the partnerships in place that we saw during Warp Speed and Active. What is it though too that the private sector needs to see in terms of guaranteed purchases or a certain guaranteed demand, that they're not just sitting there, and also subject to the ups and downs of this as well?
This is actually why we're very interested in that particular, potentially a budget strategy that particularly empowers ASPR, BARDA, and DoD and HHS writ large to actually have some core funding for some of these core preparedness activities around dedicating to the science that makes us go fast when we're trying to respond. And so we've been talking about that. You really need those key agencies that are responsible for the preparedness work, NIH, ASPR, BARDA, FDA, DoD, CDC, to have a clear increased set of funds, because the money they've got now is not going to cover new activities around preparedness. And we can't take our eye off, as Chris said before, the bio threats that we need to always be prepared for. I mean, the ASPR remit is quite broad in terms of preparedness and response, and no one wants to take any of it off the table, and I don't think we should. So if they want to actually have some of the things that Congress has deemed important, more expansive use of the SNS for various things. They want to have better manufacturing capacity at home for generics that are, we had a huge issue with the generics we needed for treating patients in the hospital, right? We didn't have enough biologics capacity for monoclonal antibodies or vaccines in the US. We didn't have enough capacity for making the antiviral drugs in the US. So knowing that there's a desire to get a little more onshoring and nearshoring with both the elements of production, the API, that part, the drug elements for making drugs at home, and the manufacturing of finished product, no one's funded to do that work right now. That's new money that ASPR in particular will need to partner with industry on manufacturing, expanding the manufacturing capacity base at home. There's also obviously a desire to have expanded manufacturing capacity globally, and they want industry to work on that as well, so that when we're going global with vaccines, they can be made in each of the regions, etc. All those things require some commitment from governments and Congress to partner with industry. This does not have to be fully paid for by government, but it has to be done in a sustainable way where industry investment and government investment are sustained over use of these technologies and these capacities during peacetime, right? You got to make something every day that's sold on the commercial market in order to be able to surge successfully during a pandemic. These things are inextricably linked. And those companies that were the most skilled at manufacturing something every day were the fastest to scale up, the fastest to make improvements that allow them to double output. You got to be good at this if you're going to be fast at this and also double your capacity. So those kinds of things, I think we're looking for a strategy for preparedness. And the AP3, the American Pandemic Preparedness Plan, is definitely an outline of a strategy. I think now we need to see how that turns into requests for funding and Congress's commitment to at least more increased funding around these specific areas. Surveillance, manufacturing capacity, and supply chain really were things that bogged us down in the US and globally, and they're going to need investment. And then R&D for the next pandemic are going to need investment in this next couple of years.
Chris, looking at the global situation, because we're talking about supply chain, and as we're in a more, shall we say, competitive or even open competition with China and other countries, how important is it to onshore or friendshore these medical supply chains?
Probably just as true here in this space as it is in things that get more attention, like semiconductors. I mean, add it to the list of things that you don't really think about it until you need it. But when you need it, you better have it, and better know where it's coming from. If we have to deal with the kind of increased kind of global pressure, the pandemic again, then yeah, we will have not learned a whole lot. Of course, companies or countries, I should say, locking down their own supply chains in the event something is pretty good indicator that something is wrong. So there is a tip to be gained there, something to be watched. But again, it's one of those things that needs to be discussed at the international level, international organizations, so that there is at least on paper agreements as to how people are going to proceed in a pandemic situation.
Well, I have so many questions, and I'll keep going. I do want to make sure, though, that if the audience has any, please do put them in the chat or Q&A function built into Zoom, and I'll try and get to them. But the next question I have, though, and Phyllis, I'll direct this to you first. You get the sense, I feel sometimes, I say this, that our policymakers might have played the game SimCity too much, and they think we can just plop down a factory here and boom, it'll start going. And there's so many inputs. We've talked about the supply chain, and one we've touched on, though, I'd like to dig in more to is workforce. We certainly talked about it in public health, because you said they don't stop doing their job and are just sitting around waiting for a pandemic. So too the pharmacists, R&D and pharma, the work done by vaccine developers, they're not just sitting around too waiting for that email that boom, this virus has appeared. How do we have a workforce as well as the surge capacity in the workforce that you might need in a time of crisis? And what can we do to promote that?
Absolutely. Great question. And this, you'll see this as actually part of, there's some interesting elements in the PREVENT Act, for example, on this issue, and we're hoping those carry over at end of year or certainly into PAPA. But this is the biologics manufacturing in particular requires a certain set of skills. And so how do we invest in increasing the number of people who have those kinds of skills and can join the workforce? What's great about this is the bioeconomy is a fantastic economic engine for the country. And so you've seen states that have realized this and aggressively pursued economic development, bringing companies in, having companies, do R&D with their academic institutions, having companies invest in manufacturing facilities close to those institutions. That ecosystem is growing in certain states that have realized how important this is to creating great, high-paying and important jobs in their state. We need to have that same view of it for the US, and that requires investing in not just STEM education, but also manufacturing education, because that's really where a lot of the skills that people need. these biologics and products have a pretty complex manufacturing process to them. And companies are always looking for skills and skilled labor to work in those facilities. And so there's a lot of interest in thinking through investments in workforce, from education to certification, to free flow of movement of people to areas where manufacturing facilities are, all are on the table and could really help with our workforce space.
Yeah, I
Yes,
don't
yeah.
look, this kind of emerging, growing bio age that we are in, as Phyllis indicated, like, look, your potential for great advancements here in treating health concerns kind of across the board. We just need to be prepared to deal with kind of the other side of those advancements, just as we did kind of in the nuclear age and the information age and the space age and everything else, bring tremendous advancements, great economic benefit. There's, of course, the other side of the coin, that they can be extremely disruptive too. And we just need to be prepared for it, as we talked about generally throughout the hour. And just be cognizant of the fact that our adversaries are looking at the same things, and they understand the same things, and they're experiencing the same things, and that, while bioterrorism, biowarfare have the potential to cause great harm, the other side of it is going to help us prepare for the response to it. And again, we'll deal with the balance. The research and development in the space is going to continue to be somewhat dual use in many ways. We just need to kind of wrap our heads around both the potential advancements as well as the challenges that it will bring.
And for the national security apparatus, almost finding the right mix of James Bond and Dr. House to keep an eye on these things. It's a new type of security challenge, not one that the traditional nuclear or military expert thought of, but
because it's a technology that proliferates highly,
right.
And that's part of its complication. Everybody's pushing for sharing this technology broadly for pandemic response. No one's talking about what Chris is talking about, which is that means this technology's everywhere. And what does that mean? And there are certain big economies like ours heavily invested in this in building this infrastructure internally, like China. They're not looking for a license for Moderna or Pfizer or anybody else's mRNA. I think you're going to see an mRNA vaccine from China very soon, right? Whatever the new tech, they're also kings of gene sequence, right? So these things we have to do well for both our own preparedness and for national security purposes.
I think we're almost at the top of the hour here, which time has flown. What a great conversation! But I'm actually glad that you mentioned China, because I do want to briefly touch on what we're seeing in current events and their reopening, and perhaps how that is a lesson too in contrasting strategies and contrasting vaccine responses. And we're seeing stories too that they're running out of Advil and Tylenol in Beijing right now. What can be seen? What do you think will we see as they've, for lack of a better term, taken the Band-Aid off on this strategy and going wholesale reopening, with the vaccines they have, with the preparedness they have? What does that situation look like to you? How it will unfold? Sorry, Phyllis. Yeah.
I was going to defer to Chris first, since I've gone first. So
I would think I'd throw it out there as if the Chinese, obviously deploying their own vaccines, I pray they work. And they have a great capacity to copy things copy things that are made elsewhere, whether it's fighter planes or vaccines. I hope they work, because otherwise they will unleash a massive population into after trying to suppress it into zero COVID for so long, that they're going to emerge straight into widely open and potentially create entire new reservoirs that we'll have to deal with, and hope at the same time that they will have learned some lessons like we're trying to learn here, but hopefully they will have learned some lessons about the need for some transparency and some international communication on what they're seeing, when they're seeing it, where they're seeing it. Because we don't really want to have to go through this exercise all over again with new strains that nobody's really prepared to deal with right now.
Agreed. I think it's also a lesson, and I agree with all of that. I think it's also a lesson in the cornerstone problem with a pandemic is there comes a point where you switch to endemic. So, and you figure out how you're going to live with it and continue to iteratively reduce the negative outcomes. Right? So we're going to have to figure out how we're going to do strain selection for COVID vaccines in the future. We're going to have to figure out how we continue to develop new monoclonals and antivirals. We are now perpetually going to see some level of COVID potentially in our lives. And there's a need now to figure out how to roll that into our overall infectious disease planning and execution every year. and that's, we're at that bubble now. And some countries made that move a little while ago, and we're making that move now. China needs to make that move. But it does therefore mean that we risk a whole new set of variants that no one was ready for, that throw us off in our transition to endemic versus pandemic. And so that collaboration, that sharing of what they're seeing what those variants are as quickly as possible, so that potentially we may need to make a different kind of booster 6 to 8 months from now. All those things need to happen because, like flu, it circles the globe in a certain way, and we'll be behind the 8 ball, even with faster technology like mRNA, if we don't have that sharing of information as quickly as we possibly can.
And then we have to overcome this kind of growing vaccine skepticism, and whether or not that potentially spills over beyond kind of the immediate, I don't want to deal with COVID vaccines, and whether that becomes, I'm not going to vaccinate my kid for measles, or deal with chicken pox, or, see the reemergence of things like polio. And I mean, those are all things that we're going to have to confront, and Congress has to be prepared to deal with, because these are, we've managed to contain and manage most of these for quite some time. To let these back into wide circulation presents some serious challenges.
As it was best said to me regarding the childhood stuff, vaccines cause adults.
It's one of my favorite things.
Yep. So I want to thank you both for joining us. Chris, Phyllis, this has been a fantastic conversation. Certainly one we're going to keep tracking as we look into what Congress is doing. I see Glenn is back. I'll let him have the final word.
Yeah, thank you, Dan, for handling the moderation. Thank you, Phyllis and Chris, for your really interesting insights. I think this is clearly like one of those ultimate wicked problems that requires so many different elements to come together, so many different elements of government, of private sector actors, and so much sort of goodwill, in addition to the effective deployment of technologies. The good news is the technologies are rapidly developing, and we have the wherewithal to take tremendous capabilities to this task. It's just, we've got to do it right. We've got to do it well, and we've got to learn the lessons and keep applying them, and be an iterative learning organization that's sort of constantly improving our processes. So as our organizational name suggests, there's a reason why we convene members of the executive and legislative branches. Also, by practice, we always include our friends from industry, because they're the ones working on the technologies that either complicate or help solve some of these important challenges. So it's vital to have them involved in the conversation. I want to thank you both, Chris, for all your time in government, and Phyllis for producing these technologies and these answers to some of these hard parts of the problem, and for sharing your insights today. We deeply appreciate it. It's a great kickoff to our series of conversations on this topic. And just want to thank our participants for tuning in. And we look forward to many further discussions on this important set of issues as we get into the new year. Thank you all very much, Chris. I like your Christmas tree looks great. So let me just wish you all happy holidays, and we'll see you soon. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Glenn. Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Phyllis.
Thank you for
Appreciate it.
inviting. Thanks. Wonderful talk.